I'm Shane Tecklenburg, and this is The Skinny.
From Fathead Studios in Speedway, Indiana, this is The Skinny. I'll rattle off a couple of things here. 2003, 4, 5, 7 Pacific Streetcar Association Pro Street Championship. Quickest turbo drag car in the history of the 8th mile, 382.6. Standing mile Viper, 240 miles per hour. Record holder at Bonneville, 237. Ferrari Enzo twin turbo.
That was 10 years ago.
Top speed
Facebook
of 2017 Bonneville Speed Week. Speed Demon Racing, 453 miles per hour. First SCCA car ever under 2 minutes per lap at Road America with Scott Tucker, level 5. Top speed of the event, new record 267. Racing, Heidecker Racing, 4GT twin turbo.
The mile. Yep.
Fastest import dragster, Fitzpatrick Racing, 2JZ dragster, 587, 239. I mean, and the list just goes on and on and on and on. And what I've always found cool about you, and the way I describe you to a lot of people, is he can get in mainstream and help you go quicker and faster, but a lot of people are already really good at that. If you have some sort of obscure power plant, turbocharged, crazy thought that has entered your brain that you think you want to make go fast, then there's one phone call to make.
I'm your Huckleberry.
He's your man because it all makes sense to you, and you love the exotic, if you will, something out of the mainstream. But because it all makes sense to you, you can come in with the ideas and say, listen, I get where you're trying to go, but there's a lot of stuff here you need to fix, but we can do this, and then next thing you know, we're setting records or winning races or whatever the case may be, which I always found super cool about you. But I'm going to have you take us way back because you're clearly a chip off the block.
Yeah.
So I really want you to fill me in, and you've told me a story 3 or 4 times. I told you whenever you come on the Skinny, I want you to tell it here. But I want to hear about your dad and your dad who created, if I'm not, help me if I'm saying this wrong, electronic fuel injection?
No, he didn't create it. No, so my dad was an auto shop teacher. I mean, my dad drag raced and did all that stuff, and he was a auto shop teacher in West Covina, California, when I was born. And he had a 32 Roadster that he was building in the garage, and as soon as I could walk, I'd go out in the garage and, help him work on the car, that which involves rearranging all his tools and, taking the file to the leg of the bench and trying to saw the bench in half with it, and all the things that 3-year-old kids do when you give tools to them. But, as I got older, that clearly gave me an interest in cars and all things racing. And one thing that my dad used to do with all of his students at West Covina High School was take them all on a field trip to the Winter Nationals every time the Winter Nationals happen at Pomona. And there are kids, well, they're not kids now, they're much older than me even, that we run into from time to time, and they're like, man, your dad totally changed the direction of my life and really changed, not necessarily, even if they're not involved in the automotive field, the reoccurring theme that they always come back with about my dad and taking his auto shop class was that he taught them how to think, not how necessarily a car engine works, but how to just think and think through problems and diagnose problems. And so they continually tell them that they still use the things that they learned from him in their everyday life, whether they actually have a hot rod that they work on or they have some other completely different career path, but that methodology of how to look at a problem and analyze it and come up with a solution to it, that's the thing that they always tell them. So anyway, having that as your dad, and being interested in cars, I always had the sounding board. Any question I ever wanted to ask about a car or engine, he always knew the answer. And so I became interested in what he was interested in, which is race cars and cars in general. And he had a automotive performance shop on the side. It had a car repair shop, was teaching high school, and then sold half of the car repair business off to his partner and opened up, almost by accident, a high performance shop. Only because he left from the auto repair shop and went over here to have a shop to do his own thing, and people start calling him going, hey, I want you to tune up my Corvette. Oh, I don't really do that. Well, I don't care if you don't do that. You're going to do it to mine because it never ran as good as when you did it. So that started that direction, and then that got him into building turbocharged ski boat engines almost by accident. And so we kind of got an in onto the turbocharged engines early on, like twin turbo small blocks. When Banks was starting to do his stuff in the early and mid 70s, my dad was dabbling, not nearly to the level that Banks was, but still doing some things for some ski race boat guys. And then he had just wanted to change direction in life and decided, we're out of here. We're out of California. We're going to go to Alaska. And he bought an auto parts store in Alaska. And we moved to Kenai, Alaska in 81. And okay, now we're Alaskans, from Southern California. So as you can imagine, this is quite a culture shock to all of us. And I was, 6 or 7 years old. So it was much less of a culture shock to me than it was to my mom and dad. I mean, to me, it was great. Now you get to go outside and you can set it on fire if you want, or shoot a gun, or chop a tree down, or ride a motorcycle, which I never got to have in California, or ride a snowmobile when there's snow on the ground, which is almost always in Alaska. So they took over a business that had been run on like 3x5 note cards for their inventory system. And so you had to spend this insane amount of time, at the end of the month going through what had been sold and, what you ordered and what was on the shelf. And he's like, there's got to be a better way to use a computer to track this information and make this easier.
What year was
this?
This
is 81.
Okay.
81.
Okay.
So in 81, he talks to some guys up there and they introduce him to this kid who's in junior high, who is like a super whiz kid computer, and he's writing programming language for Apple II computers. So they put him in touch with this kid. My dad tells him what he wants to do. By the way, there were systems on the market that did this job, but they were so expensive and out of the price range that my dad could afford. It was like, I'd rather take a risk with this kid. So he did. He tells this kid, I want to do an inventory management system. Here's how I want the thing to work. This kid writes the code for it, builds it, they implement it, and it wasn't simple. Took a couple of years to get all the bugs worked out of it. But by the time they had the bugs worked out of it, the other thing my dad had going on was he was from Southern California, where when you need an auto part, you go to the store, and if they don't have it, then you get it in the afternoon, or at the very least, you get it the next morning, because it comes from a warehouse and immediately shows up. Kenai is about 100 miles straight across an inlet from Anchorage, which is the major city in Alaska where all the stuff comes to. But to drive there, especially in the winter, you have to go over a mountain range. And it's like a 6-hour drive, or if the road's blocked off, maybe it's 2 weeks before they open it. So he goes over to the local airport. They're flying people constantly back and forth from Kenai to Anchorage that work in Anchorage. So he says, listen, I'll buy every empty seat you have on the planes going back and forth. Hires a courier service in Anchorage to take the parts over to the airport and drop them off. And now we're talking a system where we can get parts for you, and you order them in the morning, they're here at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That was unheard of up there. People were used to waiting a week or 2 weeks sometimes. So he took that business and tripled the size of it between 81 and 83. The computer system was a big part of it. And the warehouse that was supplying the parts to him said, we need to own that company now. So they wanted to buy it from him. And by then he's like, okay, we've had enough of the Alaska experience. It's time to get the hell out of here and go back where it's warm. So he sold the company to them. Came to California. So that would have been 83. Well, in 83, he didn't quite know exactly what he wanted to do. What he thought he was going to do was sell this inventory management system to other parts houses in California or wherever. So he started out trying to do that. But what he realized was when it was his business and the computer system was screwed up at 2 a.m. and he had to go down there and do whatever it was to fix it, it wasn't nearly as annoying as it was when it's one you've sold to a customer and they're calling you at 3 a.m. and you have to get up and go to their shop and fix whatever problem is going on. So he sold a couple of them and realized that wasn't going to work. Meanwhile, to make extra money, he's teaching auto repair classes at one of the local colleges. And he realizes, this is 83, all these guys trying to work on street cars are pretty much lost, because the computers that they started putting on cars to meet the federal emission standards and the California EPA emission standards in 1980 are now coming into the aftermarket, right? They're coming out of the dealership, and all these aftermarket shops get these cars where they open the hood and there's a quadrijet with wires hanging off of it, and they don't know what they're going to do with it, how to work on it, how to fix it. There's no information, all the things that they used to do, plug whatever vacuum line with a golf tee and off it goes. They don't work anymore. So he's like, man, when I had my shop and we would get a Toyota that didn't run right that came in, and we didn't work on Toyotas all the time, we'd call our buddy down the street that did Toyotas and say, hey, what always screws up on these things? Oh, it's always the vacuum advance. Okay, put a vacuum advance in it. And even if you don't know if that's what's wrong with it, by the odds, you might fix it. Or you have to go further and diagnose what's wrong. He said, man, wouldn't it be cool if there was a person you could call that knew how all of those cars worked and could answer all those questions, and a computer that could track the failures and give you a ranking of, the parts and by symptom what went wrong with these cars, just like when you used to call your buddy, at the Toyota dealership 10 years ago, or at the Toyota, independent repair shop. So he got that same kid who's now, 22 or 23, flies him down to California and says, okay, now you're going to write a database system that will track failures on cars by year, make, model, and engine, and by symptom, that's searchable by a technician on this end on the phone, and someone can call into a hotline and we'll help them go through how to fix the car. I mean, we can, at the very least, we can tell them what's the most common failure for that symptom, and they can just replace that part. And that means the guesswork will be way better because it's statistics based.
You won't have quite the salad shooter mentality on it, right?
Exactly. So he started that company, and the problem with it was that was 1983, and mechanics in general, maybe it's just people in general, they don't want to admit usually that they can't solve the problem. So it was difficult to convince them to call for help at first. But he started selling it little by little. And what happened was he saw an opportunity to help Shell Oil Company, who had a bunch of car repair shops at all their gas stations, Shell Auto Care. Shell wants to sell gas. They don't want to fix cars. But they know if the guy that's fixing cars goes out of business, they ain't selling gas either. So my dad goes over there and basically says, look, I got an idea. How about, you sign all your dealers up to my service, and I can help them be successful fixing cars so you can continue to sell gas. And they're like, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do it. So they switched it on in 1986. And he went from something that was, just barely creeping along and hardly doing anything to all of a sudden we have 6 employees, and this is something that actually, it generates income, and this is the direction he's going to go. So he keeps pushing it and eventually gets a hold of CarQuest Auto Parts. And, if you didn't know what was wrong with a car at that time, and even still, one way you solved it was by changing parts until you got the one that was bad. Well, that's bad from the standpoint of being an auto parts distributor, because you get this pile of parts that come in as returns that say they're bad when they're not really bad, and you got to eat them because you don't know if they are or not. So he basically tells them, I think I can help you with that problem too. We can help the guy be successful, pick the right part, and actually solve the problem with the car, keep them in business, and help you on the returns. Okay, let's do it. So they start selling it through all CarQuest Auto Parts stores to repair shops that are buying parts from them. Pretty soon along comes Snap-on. Hey, we want to offer a service off of our trucks where the guys... So it just built, and it was the same company with multiple different phone lines, and we had about, 26 people working for him at the time when he finally sold it. And eventually I moved into that position, and I started answering calls on the phone. So that was a huge, huge accelerated learning process of how to diagnose problems on cars. Because you got 30 or 35 calls a day with diagnostic problems on cars that you had to figure out. Not only had to figure out the car, you have to figure out how to get the guy on the other end of the phone to do what you need him to do to figure out what's wrong, or to help you figure out what's wrong. So that is where the background and the knowledge that he always had, and what the kids that went through his high school auto shop class tell him that he helped them learn how to think. The same thing with me. I mean, if there's anything I'm good at, it's at solving a problem. But it's because of that background that I'm able to do it. Right. And then I worked for that company, and Snap-on took over, and I worked for them for a few years. And then I just decided I had enough of corporate America. Of course, when my dad owned it, it was, one-stop shop. If you had an idea, you went in and you gave it to him, and good or bad, you knew your answer and you were off and running. And when Snap-on came in, it was like, we have to have a meeting to decide which light bulbs we're going to replace. It's like, okay.
Jeez.
So did he have anything to do with electronic fuel injection?
The thing that he had to do with electronic fuel injection was the fact that the cars had them. Vehicles on the road had electronic fuel injection. And he had a little hobby shop, if you want, next door to the business. And that was a place where, in order to learn how new systems worked on cars, this is pretty clever, he would go rent a new car, go rent a new Chevy Celebrity and bring it into the shop and disassemble it and take the airflow meter off of it and figure out where the wires were, and because it's how you can't get the information. Otherwise, you're waiting for the manufacturer to give you the information, and they're either going to maybe give it to you or not. I mean, and it's going to be a couple years down the road. But this way, you can figure out how the thing actually works, and more importantly than that, figure out a way to test what's wrong with it in a scenario that matches who you're dealing with on the telephone. I mean, the troubleshooting chart in a manual that comes from the factory is not written by someone that actually does the work on the car. It's written by an engineer who sits in an office, and that's why he tells you that in order to check the rear main seal, you need to start by taking the rear end housing out of the car, and then the drive shaft, and then the transmission, and then you can check the rear main. So it's a really long and involved process. It may be thorough, but no one would actually be able to do that and make any money. So it's how do I figure out what's wrong with this with the tools we actually have available and make it easier for people to solve these problems. And also, from time to time, they would have someone with a car, a part that they had solved the problem with, and say, hey, you know what? If that part's bad, would you send it in to us so we can have a look at it and see what it is in front of our face? And if we ever need to tell somebody else, we got a way better way to visualize what we're looking at. So we had this huge pile of parts, lots of different parts on the shelf. And when I was 14, I went down there and I built a go-kart out of I bought the parts for a little mini bike, and I decided I was going to build a go-kart.
This is my next question, by the way. We got to hear this entire story.
Yeah, you're going to need 2 hours for this. Anyway, so I build this go-kart, short story. I drive it around the parking lot about 3 times, and then I go, what would be better is if it had more power, right? So I start looking around on the shelf, and I see these smog pumps. And I'm like, ooh, that looks like a little supercharger. So I grab the smog pump and I go over to the motorcycle or to the go-kart engine, and I'm trying to work out how I'm going to get it on there. I figure out, okay, if I space the chain drive over just a little bit off the end of the crank, I can get a V-belt in between that and the case.
And I'm guessing this is a Briggs.
It's a Briggs, 2-horse Briggs, horizontal shaft out of an edger.
Danny's getting some ideas here, by the way. He's getting
So I'm trying to run this. This is funny. I'm trying to run this with a stock. I don't know if you've ever seen what a 2-horse Briggs carburetor looks like, but it's mounted to the fuel tank. And it has effectively one screw, and that's your mixture screw. And, it's supposed to run at rabbit and turtle and nothing really in between, right? And I'm trying to drive the thing around with a supercharger drawing through it. It was hopeless. Down the end of the block, or the end of the building from where my dad's company was a guy named Dick Shelton. Dick Shelton built quarter midget engines, okay? And Dick Shelton had these little Continental engines that he built roller camshafts for him and all kinds of cool shit. And he had a little dyno. Anyway, so he had lots of parts, and he saw what I was doing, and he said, "Look, here's a little Tillotson pumper carburetor. This is what we run on a quarter midget. Put that on there; it'll be way better." So I do, and it's definitely way better than the Briggs carburetor. But still, you go after the throttle, and the problem really wasn't the carburetor; it's the fact that when you have a supercharger that's massive, like the size of the engine, downstream from the carburetor, and then a hose coming out of that going over the intake manifold, when you open the throttle, the fuel vapor in the supercharger all effectively goes into the engine, and it's way too rich for a second while it runs on that mixture, and then it finally cleans itself up, but you can't get there with mixture screws.
And you figured that out at 12, right?
I was 14 by then.
Okay.
And maybe, yeah, I was 14 or 15. I mean, what I figured out was that no amount of adjusting the carburetor would fix the problem I had, because of course I'm trying to drag race this go-kart. I'm not like running it around in circles, because I had little wheels off of a push scooter on it. There were bicycle wheels in the front. I had hand brakes off a bicycle for the brakes in the front. So this wasn't something I was going to turn corners with. So I'm trying to drag race it. And it's like and it takes off and does a little tiny burnout, and then it runs whatever it runs. So one of the guys that works for my dad comes over one day, and I blame this guy for the way I am. He comes over and he says, "Look, why don't you just put electronic fuel injection on it? It'll solve all your problems." I'm like, "Okay, what's electronic fuel injection, right?" And he's like, "Well, here, so back to the parts shelf. Here's an injector off of a car. The fuel comes out of this end and it goes in this end. So here's a fuel pump, here's a pressure regulator. You need to tie these together in a T and get a little fuel cell, and then get this injector mounted on the intake manifold over here by the engine. And I'll come over after work today and I'll show you how we can make a really simple circuit that triggers off the points to fire this injector, and you'll be off and running." Simple enough. So I get all this done.
Absolutely.
2 years later, there's no go-kart anymore. It's a stand that mounts to the bench in the shop, right? And we're now building our own circuit boards to try to make this thing work. But effectively, it was electric fuel injection. we got rid of the points. We got rid of the ignition. We had the thing running a DIS ignition system, off of this highly complex little circuit that ran off a 555 timer. And you had an idle switch circuit and a pulse width for idle. And when the throttle switch went open, you had full power pulse width. It wasn't a whole lot better than a carburetor. It worked a lot better, but it was way better than putting the fuel in up by the top of the blower than putting it at the back of the valve. So what happens, you fast forward from there, is now I'm 16, I gave up on the whole go-kart. This is never going to work. All I have is an engine on a stand at this point. And it's kind of fun. We ran the thing on nitromethane at some point, like 100%. And I'm here to tell you, Briggs & Stratton on nitromethane doesn't sound like a Briggs & Stratton on nitromethane. It sounds like a small block Chevy with open exhaust. I mean, you hit the throttle and things like, I mean, man, it was so throttle responsive that when we first started running a pretty good amount of nitro in it, and you hit the throttle, it would shear the keyway that holds the flywheel on the crank, because the keyway is aluminum. It would just shear it right off. And then the motor would shut off because it's all out of time and it won't run anymore. It's like, ooh, that's good. Let's figure out how to keep that from spinning off of there. That'll be way better. So I decide, now I get a job, I'm 16. I'm going to build a little miniature dragster. And this is it was about 90. Yes, 90. So it's right before or right when
Vinny Knapp
is doing the junior dragster thing. So I'm sketching out. I work for the gas station, right, every night. And so, people come in and they pay with their credit card, and occasionally you have to do a full serve. But the rest of the time, I'm sketching out on the back of credit card slips how I'm going to build this dragster chassis. I'm going to save up my money and go buy this 049 wall with a weld in it, tubing, and weld this chassis together. I don't know how to weld. I mean, I've stick arc welded some 1/4-inch thick stuff with a stick arc welder, but I'm going to go figure this out with 049. So the first thing I figured out with 049 wall tubing is you ain't using an arc welder for that. It just burns a hole right in it. So then I have to teach myself how to gas weld. So I start at one end, and you could absolutely for sure tell where I started and where I finished, because I got a lot better by the time I welded 1,000 tubes in this thing. And at some point, I got the interest of my dad with a project, and he started helping me, and he said, just take the 250cc Yamaha dirt bike motor out of my dirt bike, and we'll put that in there. And then we put that in there and ran it at the drag strip, and I ran it at Carlsbad Raceway, and I went like 1679 at 74 miles an hour. That was my first trip down the drag strip. And then, of course, we needed to go faster. So we said, let's run it on alcohol. Let's get that fuel injection system we had for the Briggs motor and stick it on this 250cc dirt bike engine. So we did. And the problem was the injector that was who knows what car it came out of, used, how many 100,000 miles it had, which was fine for a Briggs, even on nitro, couldn't even come close to delivering the right amount of fuel for a 250cc dirt bike engine. In the same business park as my dad's company is another company called Motec USA.
Oh.
So we go over to Motec and buy an injector. At that time, this was called the Indy injector. This is what they ran in Indy cars, and it was a 100-pound-an-hour Rochester or Multec injector. And that was the biggest injector you could find. And so we bought an injector from them. Of course, they were, what are you doing with it? What's it going on? And we're like, yeah, you won't believe it. So they came over, George Clark from Motec came over and watched us run this dragster, because we used to run it down the street in front of the shop.
Of course.
Right, because that's what the test track was. So he
Arnie
comes
the
over
farmer,
and watches it. And
Shane Tecklenburg, same deal.
Same. Look, that's how the whole fuel injection thing started, and that's how I got involved with fuel injection and began to understand I knew how a fuel injection worked before I knew how a carburetor worked. I learned the other way around because I started with fuel injection. And once I got a carburetor, I could look at the circuits and go, oh, that's what that circuit's trying to do. That's why that works that way. So, and then, obviously as I grew up, then I went go work on regular street cars and then went to work for my dad. And then once I got to Motec, that was like, okay, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And I had lots of experience. I had zero education, but I had enough experience, and I lied and told them I knew what I was doing, and they bought it for at least a little while and let me go start playing with cars. And same thing at Motec. I started out as a backup to George Clark. George Clark had been traditionally the engine management de facto guy in the U.S. No matter what you had with a Motec, George Clark came out and tuned it. And he had worked himself to the point where he was physically not able to do that anymore, and they needed someone to take up the slack for George. So they hired me, and I pretty quickly went from taking up the slack to being the lead guy, and then it was me going all over the country working in IMSA, Grand Am, NHRA, off-road trucks, any series and or any person who had a Motec for any application, whether it was a boat or a bike or a plane or whatever, and I went there and I tuned it.
How long have you been with him?
I started in 2001, and I left there in 2006 to be on my own, basically doing the same thing as a consultant. But because of the fact that I didn't have a choice, I would have rather worked on drag race cars, but there weren't that many drag race cars using Motec at that time, and there were lots of sports cars using it. And I basically was the only guy, so I couldn't say no. Not that I wanted to. It was all interesting and cool, and to get to work in all these different genres of racing and be excited and be able to feel like I could contribute something to them, because I could show up and fix problems that were, related to drivability on the car, and I could make it run better. And so I could actually, I could see a result from the effort. And by being involved with all these different kinds of series, you learn how they do things. And then pretty soon you go to a different kind of race format and you go, you know what would work really good right here? What they do with that over there. So you get this huge cross-pollination and experience level with all these different kinds of cars. And that leads into the part you're saying where no matter what I work on, and I've been really proud of the fact afterwards that, I don't just work on one. It would be easy to get really good at one specific only, drag race, V8, twin turbo, whatever. But the fact that anything that comes my way, which I could not turn down while I worked at Motec, and afterwards I didn't want to. I turn it down now. I cherry pick, right? I wait for the ones that I think are good projects to do, or somewhere where I think I can really add some value. I don't just work on everything, but still, it's still always that same thing. It doesn't matter who comes to me with whatever they want to do. It's like, yeah, we can probably do it. No problem.
Did you hear him say cross-pollination? Because you guys made fun of me for saying that the very first week.
Well, I actually told him I'd give him $20 if he could work it into.
Yeah. We want to make Georgia feel good about saying
one
cross-pollination.
He
more
said we
person.
would split it 10 and 10. It really wasn't that big a deal. So
He's like,
And
he did say it.
Him with his long stint in Alaska, he can pull that off.
be sure to check out all the latest sun and optical eyewear at fatheads.com. Special thanks to our sponsorship partners at Elliott's Custom Trailers and Carts. This has been a production of Fathead Studios. Please remember to subscribe.